Yang berbahagia Datuk-Datuk Sri dan Datin-Datin Sri, yang berbahagia Datuk-Datuk dan Datin-Datin, distinguished speakers, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the co-hosts, WWF-Malaysia, the Worldwide Fund for Wildlife, and the British High Commission in Malaysia, as well as the Boston Consulting Group, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this two-part Facebook Live event, Nature-Based Solutions Towards Better Adaptation and Resilience from Climate Risks, a collaboration between WWF Malaysia, the British High Commission in Malaysia, and the Boston Consulting Group. I'm your host, Gary Thusera, representing Climate Governance Malaysia, or CGM, and may I say that for our part, we are very pleased and very honored to be part of this event. Ladies and gentlemen, on the 30th of November of last year, 2021, in Kuala Lumpur, WWF Malaysia and the Boston Consulting Group launched a joint report entitled Securing Our Future Net Zero Pathways for Malaysia. The report was a collaborative effort between WWF Malaysia and BCG to chart a pathway to net zero emissions for Malaysia by 2050 while addressing the urgency of mitigating the global climate crisis. The report highlights 10 priorities comprising ecosystem conservation as a key response to addressing climate change and includes climate financing, carbon pricing, and promoting innovation and safeguards to people and the environment. The report also places equal emphasis on both climate mitigation and adaptation actions. In part one of this two-part series, we will feature two very distinguished speakers who will share, firstly, about the global consensus among the scientific community regarding the urgent need for governments to assess and to respond to the needs for adaptation, and secondly, the key role that needs to be played by the business community to strengthen resilience in the face of heightened climate risk. Ladies and gentlemen, in conjunction with this event, the British High Commission in Malaysia has generously provided support for the development of two 5-minute animations on the theme of NBS, or nature-based solutions, the first of which will be launched at today's event. So it is now with great pleasure that I yield the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Charles Hay, British High Commissioner to Malaysia, to deliver his pre-recorded welcome remarks. Welcome, Excellency.
It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar that the British High Commission is co-hosting with WWF Malaysia. For the UK, acting on climate change is a major part of our foreign policy, not least through our hosting of last year's COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. If you follow any news about climate change at all, you'll be familiar with the recently completed IPCC reports on climate adaptation and mitigation. They tell a deeply unsettling story of the very real climate impacts that are already with us, and the fact that we are not currently on a trajectory to realise the goal set in the Paris Agreement of keeping global warming to below 1.5 degrees centigrade. While these reports are just a few weeks old, those messages have been clear for some time now. As a result, at Glasgow, countries agreed a new set of commitments called the Glasgow Climate Pact. Part of this pact addresses the need to rapidly increase our ambitions on climate mitigation through a call for countries to revisit and strengthen their national pledges and cut emissions faster. The rapid fall in the cost of renewables make an even faster clean energy transition all the more possible and a sound investment choice for the future. But the Glasgow Climate Pact also aims to provide fresh attention to the urgency of building climate resilience. We need to prepare to adapt to these climate impacts, such as extreme rainfall or rising sea levels. For instance, the Glasgow Climate Pact includes a commitment by developed countries to double adaptation finance by 2025. This is the first time an adaptation-specific finance goal has ever been agreed. At COP26, nature also was prominent in a way that it hadn't been in previous UN climate negotiations. I hope you'll have heard of the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on forests and land use, this is a landmark commitment by 140 countries to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. We were delighted that Malaysia joined in this commitment, especially as Malaysia is one of the world's mega-diverse countries, where her forests and seas are full of unique species and ecosystems that human prosperity ultimately depends on. Beyond COP26, the UK is seeking also to link climate and biodiversity issues together. At this year's UN Biodiversity Talks, we're leading the call for countries to agree on a new ambition of protecting 30% of the planet by 2030, the 30 by 30 goal, as it's known. And we would urge Malaysia to support this goal as well. I've mentioned some of the challenges of climate mitigation and adaptation, and I've mentioned the emphasis on nature at COP26 and beyond. So as a result, I'm delighted to launch these animations today, which bring these themes together. Without stealing the thunder of the stories these animations are telling, the value of thinking in terms of nature-based solutions is already demonstrated through work that the British High Commission supports locally. Through the Newton and Kuala Fund, for example, we supported UK-Malaysia research collaboration on how to protect Selangor's mangroves for the benefit of local communities. And in Terengganu, we're working with the state government to develop a financing framework to protect state land, especially by recognising the value of the ecosystem services from that land. Nature is a solution to so many of the economic, environmental and social challenges that we face. I hope that these animations can help us tell this story more widely and inspire us all to protect our common home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your kind words of welcome and for contextualizing the recent international events, including the COP in Glasgow, as well as the IPCC assessment report, including the 30 goals. Without further delay, therefore, I will invite the Secretariat to launch the first of the 5-minute animations on nature-based solutions.
The world we live in today is fraught with new challenges that generations before us have not experienced. Climate change threatens food and water security, increases the frequency and intensity of disasters, upending lives and wreaking economic havoc. But we have answers to these challenges within Malaysia. The rich natural ecosystems that our country possesses are potential nature-based solutions, or NBS, to address multiple socio-economic and environmental issues. The world has already agreed that nature-based solutions are actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage natural or modified ecosystems. These actions could address a multitude of social, economic, and environmental challenges such as food security, water security, climate change, biodiversity loss, disaster risk reduction, human health, and socio-economic development. The conservation of mangroves is a model example of investing in NBS. Mangroves are important ecosystems for biodiversity and provide many ecosystem services. They act as a nursery for fisheries, providing food and shelter for young fish to mature. They take in carbon from the atmosphere and are effective natural barriers to extreme weather events, protecting the coast from rising sea levels, erosion, and floods. Conservation, restoration, or sustainable replanting of mangroves provide livelihood to communities, protect their homes, and support economic activities such as fisheries and ecotourism. It is estimated that every dollar invested in mangrove conservation and restoration delivers $3 in benefits. WWF-Malaysia is striving to realize the potential of several NBS initiatives. We are actively working on the conservation of watersheds, such as Baleh in Sarawak and those located within the Ulu Muda and Fraser's Hill forest complexes in Kedah and Pahang, respectively. The protection of these landscapes will also provide other benefits, such as for biodiversity conservation, sequestering carbon, flood control, and regulating water flows. The sustainable management of wetlands and their water catchments safeguards vital ecosystem functions such as flood control. In the Setiu Wetlands Terengganu, our researchers found that spawning grounds for grouper species and shellfish need to be conserved to sustain fishery resources. We engage with the local community to promote wetland stewardship that provides livelihoods. These include replanting mangroves, organizing ecotourism activities, and generating and selling sustainable products made from wetland resources such as gelam trees or melaleuca and kerchut plants or wild sedge. Marine protected areas are another nature-based solution that strengthens ecosystems and communities' resilience to cope with the impacts of climate change. Guided by a local early action plan, local communities in Semporna are adopting nature-based solutions such as coral planting and rehabilitating habitat to reduce stresses on fish stocks. WWF-Malaysia also supports authorities in the Tun Mustafa Park to implement coral restoration strategies through the principle of co-management, which is working with communities. Healthier, more diverse reefs sustain dive tourism, safeguarding local livelihood, supplying foods, and improving climate resilience through the protection of coastal areas from erosion. Nature provides so many solutions to today's challenges and plays an essential role in the global effort to achieve the UN's Sustainable Development Goals SDGs. But we need to seize these opportunities. We need to invest in nature in our communities and across Malaysia. We need to be advocates for nature-based solutions. Will you join us so we can live in harmony with nature?
So once again, a big thank you to the British High Commission in Malaysia for supporting the development of that animation. If you want to see the second, be sure to tune in on Wednesday for part 2 of this series. And on to the featured guests for today. Our first guest, we're very pleased to have Prof. Dr. Joy Jacqueline Pereira. She's a fellow of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia and a principal research fellow for Southeast Asia Disaster Prevention Research Initiative Institute for Environment and Development at CPRE at University Kebangsaan Malaysia, or UKM. Professor Pereira is Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability. She was Review Editor for the 2018 IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees and the 2019 IPCC Special Report on the oceans and the cryosphere. At the national level, Professor Pereira chairs the Malaysia Research Network on Climate, Environment and Development, known as MyClimate, and serves as a resource person to the Malaysian government in negotiating international agreements. You'll have to trust me, she's eminently qualified for all these things. She has graduated about 40 doctoral and master's candidates through research supervision and has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles. Over to you, Prof. Joy. You can begin your slide presentation.
Thank you for the kind words, Dr. Gary. So I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for giving me an opportunity to share the findings of the Working Group 2, which was released in February earlier this year on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And this report involved 270 authors from 67 countries, in terms of gender diversity, we had good representation from both men and women, and also scientists from the developing and developed world. More than 34,000 scientific papers were assessed, and each of the 62,000 review comments were actually addressed by the authors. So a key aspect is that there's growing scientific evidence that climate change is indeed a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. And any further delay in a resolute global action will result in us missing the rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. And some of the new understandings that have come across is the interconnections between climate change and human society, and climate change and ecosystems, and between society, humans, between human society and ecosystems, as well as aspect that related to the limits to adaptation and losses and damages. And I will try to highlight much of the nature related messages here. And first and foremost, being that global warming has caused dangerous and widespread disruption in nature, and climate change is affecting lives of billions of people despite efforts to adapt. And these are all observations, and that some up to 3.6 billion people live in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. And the impacts are actually magnified in cities where more than half of the world's population lives. And in regard to this, we anticipate that the next cycle of the IPCC, we will be focusing a special report on cities. And I would like to encourage everybody to get your work documented in the peer-reviewed journals, so that the IPCC can pick up some of the findings related to the tropical region. And in terms of biodiversity loss at different warming levels, this is on the left panel is what's expected in a 0.1, 0.5 degree world, where you have already experiencing up to 25% losses of biodiversity worldwide. And in a 3 degree world, some 75% losses are expected in pockets where we see the projections indicate where the hotspots occur. And some losses are already, which are attributed to climate change, are already irreversible. And we've seen first species extinctions, and there's attribution studies connecting this. And even temporarily exceeding 1.5 degrees warming will result in some additional irreversible severe impacts. That's even if you go through a decade or two of 1.5 degrees, you will expect irreversible impacts. And this is very important, because Working Group 1's key message is that biophysically you can actually move beyond 1.5 degrees and have an overshoot, and then bring back the global warming levels to below 1.5 degrees, as indicated by the technologies available in Working Group 3. But Working Group 2's message of science is very clear that we will still have impact. So anything beyond even a temporary overshoot of 1.5 degrees has got irreversible impacts in terms of its what to expect, particularly for nature and its crucial services that are at risk in a warming world, from the humble bee and the pollination process to the coastal protection, tourism, food resources, our health, and the regulatory aspects for climate, in terms of clean air and also water filtration. So future global risks are expected with respect to heat stress, and this is important for us in the tropics. Water scarcity in this region is more a management issue. We need to manage water better. Food security and flood risks, particularly in the coastal cities and settlements. So in terms of what is observed, action on adaptation has increased. There is evidence of that, but the progress is uneven, and we are not adapting fast enough. Yeah, so that's the evidence from the ground, and we have also got evidence of nature offering significant untapped potential. And here, the work on our institute on organizations that are available in the countries such as WWF and other partner NGOs are very critical. So what are the kinds of options that you have for the water sector? It covers on the farm level from irrigation to rainwater storage, yeah, to moisture conservation, and which yields economic and ecological benefits and provides wider options in terms of securing drinking water and managing floods and drought risks and working with nature. But bear in mind that the effectiveness of these nature-based solutions, they decrease with increased warming. Yeah, so that's an important point to take away. And similarly for food security, you have many effective options on the farm level, yeah, right up to strengthening biodiversity that yields similar kinds of wider benefits from food to health to livelihoods. Yeah, and in cities as well, yeah, we will be very urbanized, and cities will be homes to two-thirds of the world's population, and there are many effective options such as nature-based and engineering hybrid approaches, establishing green and blue spaces, urban agriculture, having social safety nets for disaster management, and then these also yield wider benefits. But we do have to be careful that adaptation of maladaptation, which is adaptation that results in unintended consequences, primarily to the most disadvantaged groups. And these come in the form of grey infrastructure that do not take into account other options. And there are also limits to adaptation. Even effective adaptation, grey, blue, or green, cannot prevent all losses and damages, and natural solutions may no longer work above 1.5 degrees Celsius. So above 1.5 degrees Celsius, small islands will have freshwater problems, yeah, and this is not only restricted to small island states in the Pacific, but also small islands in the tropics in Malaysia and Indonesia. We have a lot of islands, and beyond 2 degrees, it will be challenging to farm multiple staple crops. So it is essential for us to make rapid, deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions to keep the maximum number of adaptation options open. Yeah, that's critical for us. So we need to accelerate adaptation at the same time, particularly in areas that are more exposed to the risk, climate risks, and this requires political commitment, institutional frameworks, enhancing knowledge of impacts and risks, particularly at the local level, so that we can have improved responses, monitoring and evaluation, and inclusive governance. Climate resilient development is all about prioritizing equity and justice and direct participation. So if you look at the wider benefits of adaptation, here just to show you the examples of some land and ocean ecosystems on the left panel and urban infrastructure systems, let's look at this first purple box here in terms of forest-based adaptation, where it has got high potential feasibility and synergies with mitigation with so many positive outcomes with SDGs. Moving on, in the land and ecosystem, ocean ecosystems, biodiversity management and ecosystem connectivity, although of medium feasibility, also has very high synergies. Yeah. Similarly, in the urban and infrastructure in systems, if the incorporation of green infrastructure and ecosystem services, while feasibility is the potential feasibility is at a medium level, it has got high synergies. And why do these feasibilities they result in a medium level? It's simply because we do not have the evidence out there. Yeah. So if you've in terms of moving on towards climate resilient development, the solutions framework from Working Group 2 considers government and all levels of civil society. Forming partnerships is critical involving everyone, drawing on a wide range of knowledge, not only from academia, but also indigenous, local, and practical knowledge, all that comes from our NGOs that are working out in the field and civil society organizations that are working. So we need that wide-ranging knowledge, and collaboration is key. And you have other aspects such as needs, the conservation and restoration of ecosystems are fundamental, involvement of marginalized group, prioritizing equity and justice, and reconciling all the different interests, values, and worldviews, and the scaling up of investment and international cooperation. So the prospects for climate resilient development, ladies and gentlemen, will become further limited if warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius, and it may not be possible if warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. And this is coming from the message of scientists from Working Group 2, which are many of us who are involved in dealing with ecosystems and the impacts of climate risks. Okay, and what is then in the future? We need to reduce climate risk in terms of adaptation, of acceleration. We need increasingly, we all need to push for reduced greenhouse gas emission. Yeah, if we wish to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, Working Group 2 or Working Group 3 has already indicated that we need to reach 45% GHG gas reduction by 2025, which means we have to peak in the next 2 years. We need enhanced biodiversity. We have to achieve, in order to achieve the sustainable development goals. And this is what climate resilient development is all about. So the science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Prof. Joy, for your very enlightening presentation, particularly focusing on the science of climate change and the growing consensus among the scientific community globally that the window is closing rapidly and that we need to accelerate our actions because the effectiveness of nature-based solutions is actually impacted by the changes that nature itself is experiencing in the face of global warming and climate change. Let's turn next to our second speaker for this afternoon, Mr. Joel Kwong of the Boston Consulting Group, Malaysia. Joel is a partner at Boston Consulting Group, where he focuses on climate and sustainability. This is his practice area, and he has worked with numerous corporate entities and governments regionally on environmental and sustainability and governance topics, ESG topics, including charting national pathways and developing climate policies to achieve net zero emissions targets. Joel, the floor is yours. You can begin your slide presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Gary, and good afternoon to everyone on the call. Today, I'll build on some of the perspectives on ANR, the global perspectives there, and how this relates to Malaysia, especially referencing some of the findings from the BCG WWF Net Zero report. And finally, we'll cover some of key ANR solutions, which are key foundations for enhanced climate resilience, such as climate analytics, a little bit later in the presentation. So if we go to the next slide, I think building on what was covered earlier in the call, right? It's key that we think about different ways to alter the trajectory of carbon emissions to limit the level of global warming. Through the climate science, there's increased evidence, right, on the causal relationship between CO2 emissions and temperature rises. And in fact, if we continue on our current trajectory, we will see, increased temperature towards 4 to 5 degrees by the end of the century. I mean, even with current pledges in the latest COP26, that still is far away from the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that we aim to achieve. And so this will require multiple pronged response, both on the mitigation as well as adaptation side. Go to the next page. And even between the 1.5 degree and 2 degree scenario, this has tremendous implications on adaptation. Right? So for example, if in a 2 degree scenario compared to 1.5 degrees, in terms of severe heat waves, 1.7 billion more people are expected to be affected once in 5 years. Rise in sea levels, exposed to climate risk and poverty, on food security, on fisheries as well, and on the coral reefs. There are tremendous impacts based on the current, even if the current plans are met within COP26. Go next page. And there will be no hiding from climate change, and every region will be affected. Right? So what we see, from some of the latest science is that, in terms of change in extreme heat and change in heavy precipitation, no region will be left untouched, and it's really a global phenomenon that we're looking at, right? In terms of even enumerating the various physical climate hazards, 35 of them have been identified, and these will all come as a result of the increase in global warming. We go to the next page. And in fact, what's very interesting about this, and also very concerning, is that the countries most vulnerable to climate change will have also historically contributed the least to atmospheric concentrations. Right? So essentially, this is not only a global challenge, but also one challenge of overall climate equity across different countries. If you look at the graph where we have vulnerability on the y-axis and emissions per capita on the x-axis, we find that essentially some of the most vulnerable countries on the left-hand side in the red are ones which have the lowest GDP per capita, have contributed the least to historic emissions, but are the most vulnerable. Go to the next page. And one of the key unlocks here is really adaptation finance, right? Unlocking this to fund a much needed investment in climate adaptation and resilience solutions. This has grown significantly over the past years. For example, a 20% per annum growth since 2015. But really, we need a step change in climate finance to achieve anywhere near the goals that we need to see in terms of investment in order to counteract this large problem. And today, adaptation only accounts for about 7% of overall climate finance, and this significantly needs to improve. And so when we think about a holistic response to climate change, essentially there are 4 pillars under the Paris Agreement. One is looking at mitigation, which is really around lowering or removing GHG emissions from the atmosphere. So that's one. Adaptation and resilience, where we adjust to withstand the impacts of climate change, but also, even with our best efforts on mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, there will be loss and damage as a result of climate change. So how do we also make sure we mitigate and manage the residual impacts of insufficient mitigation and adaptation from some of these adverse climate impacts? And when we talk about climate finance, that underpins all 3 areas. Financing and investments are needed across the board, from mitigation to adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, in order for us to be more resilient and to adapt to some of the worst effects of climate change. And in fact, on the right, if you go one by one, essentially the quote for, it's very telling, right? The adaptation is really not an alternative to a redoubled effort to stop climate change, but it's really an essential complement to it. And failing to act on this adaptation will result in huge economic and human tolls. Next page. So we spoke about global impacts of climate change. How does this impact Malaysia, and what are some solutions that we think about at the country level? And over the past year, BCG and WWF has been working together on a joint study to develop the net zero pathways for Malaysia, and this has been published and is available for public reference. And essentially, in this study, we look at what are some potential pathways for Malaysia to achieve net zero GHG emissions by a sector view. And this focus mainly on mitigation, but we also speak about how adaptation and resilience is key to this. We look at how these solutions can also have a positive social and economic impact on the country, and also essentially look at how this can support overall development in the country. Finally, this involved engagement across a wide group of stakeholders, including the EACs, international foreign delegations, civil society, and so on and so forth, to produce this report. We go to the next page. And essentially within this report, there are 10 key priorities that we identify. From the first three, which includes protecting our natural assets, which are a huge source of carbon sinks for Malaysia, to decarbonizing key sources of emissions in the country, from energy to transport. From 4 to 8, we look at other key enablers critical for this pathway as well, including how do we price in the negative externality of carbon, to mobilizing climate finance, spurring innovation and scaling technologies. Number 7, making sure that we have the right safeguards to ensure total societal and environmental benefit. Number 8, making sure that we have enhanced human capital and equitable workforce transition. And number 9 and 10, where we see key movements from consumers' behavioral change, strengthened efforts from the public and private sector being key catalysts for this climate action. But in addition to these areas, we also recognize the importance of adaptation and resilience. If you go to the next page. And through our engagement with many stakeholders, this is also seen as a key priority, right? So looking at how we consider physical risk to Malaysia and the country, and how this will affect our overall economy. Making sure that we factor in investments required to protect industries facing this physical risk, and really understanding the sector by sector as well as local implications of climate change, such as impact on coastal inundations, impact on plantations, smallholders, and so on and so forth. So really emphasizing, this was emphasized as a key priority alongside mitigation in the report. We go to the next page. Yeah, and this was, highlighted as one of the key chapters, how we think about the importance of adaptation and resilience. Go to the next page. And really, this is something which hits hard and hits home, and something which is very real to what's happening in Malaysia. From various articles we see in the news on the impact on food security as a result of climate change, to massive floods that we see, in recent memory, and also in various landslides and so on and so forth. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? And many different areas, where climate change will affect. Go to the next page. And essentially, this requires urgent and large-scale solutions. And when we work with governments globally, we think of various angles which are important to set the right foundations to embark on adaptation resilience. Everything ranging from an integrated national adaptation framework, which resonates with a lot of the synergies mentioned earlier during the session, to how do we leverage climate analytics, because solutions to adaptation and resilience are by definition at a local level, and there will be geographical nuances to factor. And finally, how do we mobilize action and funding against this, which we saw as an extremely critical priority. Go to the next page. And just to bring that to life, we've been, for example, working with the Philippines government, which is one of the most severely exposed countries to climate change, right? So 9th most disaster-prone country in the world, 60% of the population in low-lying coastal areas, which are highly subject to rising sea levels, urban populations in highly vulnerable areas, as well as a large degree of forest loss, which is a key adaptation and resilience lever. You go to the next page. And essentially, one of the foundations of this is to look at how climate analytics could be adopted to support decision-making for policymakers in the Philippines, which is very targeted to solutions needed at a local level. So key questions which were asked include, how do I better forecast scenarios of climate hazards in different areas? For these different areas affected, what are the social, economic, and natural impacts of this change? And what are the adaptation priorities weighing across the trade-offs of different solutions, and where should investment be deployed to gain maximum impact? Next page. And yeah, so looking at really taking climate analytics using various sources of public, private data, bringing that together to look at anticipating where will be the hotspots for adaptation resilience, climate change impact, as well as adaptation resilience solution, and looking at what is the social, economic, and natural impact from the different areas in order to inform policies at the government level, but also action at the corporate level. And these were some of the some of examples of some of the areas that we looked at. If we go to the next page. And this is, again, not only exclusive to Philippines. It is being taught about by many different countries around the world. So, for example, when we worked with the World Food Program and Kenya, some of the challenges faced there are different. So, in Philippines, it was a lot around sea level rise because of their coastal areas. In other countries, for example, it's about drought impact and response. So, we're really trying to understand what is the impact of drought on agriculture yields, on economy and trade as a country which is highly reliant on these agricultural driven GDP. How would the vulnerable populations be impacted, and what would be the cost of inaction? And what are the responses to prioritize to counter some of these effects? And all of this climate analytics is essentially a foundation. And if you go to the next page, to thinking about what are comprehensive adaptation and resilience plans and frameworks for the countries. And essentially, this is no longer a nice to have, but a must have, where we need to adapt to multiple human and natural systems to the worst effects of climate change. So everything from looking at how cities and infrastructure should change, looking at water access, health and well-being, nature, biodiversity, agriculture and food security, and also some of the underlying areas such as vulnerable populations, vulnerable economic sectors, where increased focus needs to be placed. And all of this to say that it's an extremely important area, one that still a lot needs to be done, and it's also like other countries, an extremely important priority for Malaysia as well. With that, I can come to the end of the presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Joel, for that very, very fascinating presentation. I'm sure that the audience has a great deal of questions that they would like to ask. And as you've been seeing at the bottom of your screen, what you could do is simply type your question in the comment section of your Facebook Live, and the Secretariat will capture those questions and transfer them to me. Kindly address your question either to Prof. Joy or to Joel, and we'll be happy to have them answer the questions for you. To begin with, perhaps, just generally speaking, the concepts of adaptation and mitigation have not always enjoyed the level of understanding that they do now. In fact, the level of relatedness that is acknowledged currently. In the past, mitigation was said to have global impacts, because if you reduce emissions, you're actually reducing the speed of climate change onset. Whereas adaptation was touted, particularly by the developed countries, to have only local impacts. And so for many years, this was used as a reason for developed countries to not fund as highly adaptation measures as opposed to mitigation measures. It's gratifying to see now that in the IPCC and other reports that there's a much stronger linkage between mitigation and adaptation. I'd like to ask both of our speakers this evening, to what extent do you believe that there's a clear understanding between the linkage between adaptation and mitigation among all the stakeholders? Of course, the scientists do understand, but perhaps among the general population, what are the areas that perhaps need a bit more capacity building to drive home this very strong linkage between mitigation and adaptation? Perhaps we could begin with Prof. Joy.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gary, for the question. I think you're being very generous when you say scientists have a better understanding about adaptation and mitigation being integrated. I'm afraid even in the IPCC, we have from Working Group 2 a lot of trouble convincing our colleagues from Working
Mhm.
Group 3 and Working Group 1 that climate
Okay.
resilient development actually includes both adaptation and mitigation. Yeah, and there is some that sometimes some people have the view, and this is in the highest level of leadership in the science, that because the Paris Agreement clearly separates out adaptation and mitigations, science should do the same, which is
No.
not agreed to collectively by the groups in Working Group 2. So we have a very resounding message that climate resilient development, it's about both adaptation and mitigation. And if you actually take an issue in the spatial context, if you go to Port Klang, for example, how can you differentiate adaptation action and mitigation action and environmental conservation action in that area? Yeah, you can't differentiate it in terms of coming. You would integrate it and in, yeah, in your implementation. So that's how you need to look at this issue. So my point, sorry, Dr. Gary, is that we should take it in an area-based approach, and this allows for the integration to happen seamlessly. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Joel, anything to add?
No, fully agree with Prof. Joy. I think all the makes a lot of sense, right? In fact, that before Prof. Joy said that, I wanted to mention also that much less the integration between adaptation and mitigation, even the awareness of the importance of early action on adaptation is fairly low across the board, right? So yeah, so I think that definitely there is room to improve. That definitely growing momentum, but definitely still room to improve across stakeholders overall. And I think for example, when we think about Malaysia's situation, right, when we think about some of the largest areas which helps us to achieve on net zero, such as restoring and retaining our forests, right? That's a very important mitigation solution, but also extremely important adaptation resilience solution.
Yep.
And looking at them in a non-integrated manner and separately actually reduces the benefit of that, right? So for example, when we look at valuing forests, is not only looking at valuing it from the carbon they sequester, which is looking at mitigation, but also all these co-benefits that they bring, right? And so splitting them apart does it a disservice, right? And essentially, it's very important to look at it together to realize the full value of some of the assets that we have.
Thanks, Joel. Perhaps another question for both of our speakers in turn. Many of us can comprehend the impact of delayed action or delayed transition on mitigation, essentially kicking the can down the road to a later time when we intend to cut our emissions, and we can see the impacts of that. But is there as clear an a sort of result or an impact or a picture when it comes to delayed transition or delayed action on adaptation? What are the risks for Malaysia and perhaps for other vulnerable countries in Southeast Asia? We mentioned the Philippines as a country that's extremely exposed to climate change. What are the impacts of an inability perhaps to implement adaptation measures at the rate that we would like? Perhaps we could begin with Joel. Is that all right?
Yeah. And I think this one is one that a lot of us can relate with, taking an example from the recent floods, right? So for example, the cost of damage and loss, on property, cars that people have, essentially whole savings built out over a lifetime, right? And really that is the cost of not adapting early enough, right? And that and the impacts that has on social economic well-being, right? As for example, the assets that you have are wiped out. To the fiscal perspective for a government where a lot of even with a very tight fiscal budget, then money needs to be spent to restore infrastructure and so on and so forth. I think that's really some of the real impacts of a lack of adaptation and resilience, right? And really prevention in this case, right? And smart prevention is much more affordable than cure, right? Or post post loss, like for loss and damage, right? And really that sums it up in terms of why we need to act now. And just using a recent example that we have.
Prof. Joy, anything to add?
I agree totally with everything that Joe said in terms of the need for action. And I'd just like to make a point that whilst no region is untouched by climate change, the impacts that are projected are actually spatially differentiated. That means the impacts will play out differently in different places, and the regions from the global context, the regions that are most at risk initially with global warming of 1.5 degrees is the small island states in the Pacific, the tropics, and the Arctic. So you'll find that it plays out there first. Yeah, so we will actually be the frontliners for the impacts. So in this context, we really need to not only to accelerate adaptation, we need increased ambition for emission reduction at the global level. Yeah. So that is the country needs and the region needs a two-pronged strategy. Yeah. And why do we, does that mean we can delay our transition? No, because as we push the global players to enhance their ambition, there's going to be a lot of stranded assets. And therefore, we need to make that transition at that same time so we don't end up with a lot of stranded assets. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for the questions. I'd like to get to some of the questions from the audience, but perhaps one last question before we take that turn. We're talking about adaptation, but we're also talking about nature-based solutions, and a lot of the adaptation that is being put in place by countries, including countries like Malaysia, is what might be classified as non-nature-based solutions. For example, hard structures, drainage structures, that sort of thing. How would you contrast non-nature-based solutions versus nature-based solutions? What are some of the key differences that you would highlight in terms of how to get the maximum benefit from nature-based solutions? Are there any particular sensitivities that nature-based solutions might present, or challenges that nature-based solutions might present compared with what might be understood as more traditional types of adaptation measures? Perhaps Prof. Joy?
Thank you, Dr. Gary. So I'm going to touch on nature-based solutions in the context. When we have these discussions, context is very important. In the context of an urban setting, you have a lot of room for blue-green infrastructure. I mean, the obvious examples about tree providing more shade, vegetation having cooling effect, green areas that allow for drainage and floodwater storage, yeah, coastal wetlands, if your city is by the side for erosion, flood storm, and all of these need adequate financing. Yeah, that's number one. But in actually, that is why when we say climate resilient development, there are a few aspects that are very critical. The first foremost being equity, and it's actually about a rights-based approach where you are pro-poor. Yeah, you are ensuring that the vulnerable groups are given adequate attention. Yeah, so in an urban setting, if you don't take care of these things, there are challenges such as gentrification, for example. That's where an area becomes so nice and nature-based that only rich people will stay there, and the poor people have to move out. So those are the kinds of things that you need to actually look into. And even in cases of nature-based solutions outside of urban areas where indigenous people are displaced and such. So that's why in climate resilient development, the aspects of equity and justice are really critical in this component. Thank you.
Yes. What about you, Joel? Anything to add to
Yeah.
that?
I can't agree more with Professor Joy. I think she covered most
Okay.
of the key points, right? Yeah. So I mean, just to add briefly on it, I think it needs to come in tandem. We cannot rely just solely because of the pace of decarbonization we cannot rely solely on nature-based solutions. For example, we do need to decarbonize the energy sector. We do need to decarbonize the transport sector, and all those are non-nature-based but equally important priorities. I think the one point maybe I build on is when nature-based solutions has historically had a bit of a bad name, right, reputation, because of how corporates treat it with carbon offsets, right? So they think that it's a way out, right? That corporates can continue polluting, buying carbon offsets with nature-based solutions and getting away with that pollution, right? And there's been historical challenges about whether these offsets or through, for example, the voluntary carbon market is really additional or permanent, or is it, corporate greenwashing, right? And that's some of the history of it, where now standards like the SBTI coming in is definitely very key, right? And that I think can position again nature-based solutions on the right track. Definitely an important part, but just making sure we separate real nature-based solutions from corporate greenwashing is critical.
Yeah, thanks, Joel, and thank you so much for highlighting that. Also, I suppose what would be really helpful is an increased understanding about what nature-based solutions are involved in mitigation, which is the role of credits and offsets, versus adaptation, which is actually to reduce the impacts of climate extreme weather events. Moving on to some of the questions from the audience. Thank you so much for your questions. We have a question from Fong this evening. Could we talk more about biodiversity loss in Malaysia? How much is the climate perhaps impacting biodiversity in Malaysia, and what can the public, how can communities help? How does biodiversity loss impact our adaptation efforts? And is there anything that the public can do to address biodiversity loss, which will also help with adaptation? So we're talking about a kind of co-benefits here, a sort of, to use a very bad analogy, two birds with a single stone, but to basically undertake adaptation and mitigation at the same time. So it's a bit of a long question with a few parts, but I believe our speakers can see the question, and I'd like to direct this first to Prof. Joy, if that's all right, Prof.
Thank you. In terms of looking at the findings of Working Group 2, we have for the first time actually linked climate change, humans and nature, including biodiversity loss, and its important interconnections. And if you look at the Malaysian case, I think I wouldn't want to speak to it because there are so many experts already working on the issue. But I think the important point is to actually look at biodiversity now, not only in the context of mitigation alone, in terms of its RED benefits and such, but also looking at its in an integrated way, its function for adaptation. So that I think is a mindset that we need in this country, moving away from the very conventional mitigation driven agenda. So I think what can people do? People can actually build that awareness. Perhaps we are in the audience in the panel today, we are in our 50s and we are seeing all these extreme events. A child who is 10 years old today is 4 times more likely to see what we are going to see in the next decade, and in terms of extreme events. And and a 10-year-old child today is going to see coastal settlements inundated. Uh, and this is particularly in the South and Southeast Asian region. These are projections. Even if your emission is zero today,
Today.
the lock-in effect of the sea level rise was going to lead to all these migration issues. And really, children of today not only need to be taught and pushing. I think they are more behaving like adults in preserving the planet in many instances that I've seen compared to decision makers and politicians. So they need to push, and that public awareness has to be built, and there's a lot the public can do, and we shouldn't feel like victims. We should move the agenda. Thank you.
Thanks. What about you, Joel? Anything
Yeah,
to add
fully
on that?
agree.
Yeah.
Fully agree. And I think if we think about some of the biodiversity loss in Malaysia, there are many drivers, right? There's definitely can't pinpoint it to a few, but one of the big ones has been deforestation or forest degradation, which has affected the habitats of animals. And if we think of some of the biggest causes of deforestation in the past, right? This is, for example, expanding, as we grow, cities develop, and also as agricultural land, for example, palm oil expands, right? That comes at the cost of deforestation. And as we think about the role, and this has already improved over the past years, right? We think of the role of everyone on the call. You are two things. Number one, you're a consumer, right? As a consumer, you can express your consumer preferences, which will affect corporates because you are a key source of demand, and that shapes their behavior, right? So as you can see how now a lot of palm oil companies are extremely aware about the impacts of deforestation and make every effort, to do that because it's important for the consumer. And also number two, you're a voter, right? A lot of us on the call are voters, and essentially making that sure that this, debates the importance of, preserving the environment comes into the mainstream debate for policy. It shapes how people vote. That's also a tremendous lever, right? For you to influence policymakers, because votes are important, right, for government as well. And I think these two are the channels which you can play, but also being a voice in in society, socially, and so on and so forth. Right? I think these are the roles that different people can play.
Thank you so much. I'm going to do something a bit naughty and try and push you a bit further on some of these questions. Obviously, yes, we are consumers. And for many of us, of course, we try to be conscientious and we try to be informed and responsible consumers. But really, when we are faced with, for example, the recent floods, how can that directly and immediately be transformed into a change of behavior or attitude or preference that we as communities can actually carry forward. And it's a bit unfair, perhaps, but I think our audience would like to delve a little bit deeper into this, if you'd be so brave. Can we start with Prof. Joy?
Well, yeah, happy to share what I experienced in a consultation with people from Klang and Port Klang under their parliament, led by their parliamentarian, and the whole room was a very angry crowd, as you can imagine. They have been impacted, and they were in no mood for compromises. Yeah, and as I say, they that's when I saw how citizen scientists are already readily available, yeah, in the audience. That was not an uneducated crowd, but it was a crowd that certainly was the first time experiencing such an event. And you can see already the resilience is building up, and how they were preparing for the next event. Although they were demanding for action, and there were plans to take legal action, and there were voices saying that they would only vote for another party that actually speaks to this issue of climate change. They had actually made the links. So my message to the crowd was very simple. Everything that they do, they are the frontliners, and the rest of the country is going to learn from their experience. So therefore, I was informing them that the actions that they take, we can only learn from the worst disaster that actually happens to us. Yeah. No matter how, for decades now, science has been saying that we have a climate problem, and now we are left with 2 years to peak, and only now, even then, we have people who are saying let's wait. Yeah. So for me, in that context, Dr. Gary, I think people are moving more of such. I was very. I think I was transparent and being true to my science by saying that this is not something that will go away, and we expect more to come. Yeah, it's not that we want to be the bearer of bad news, but we need to alert people that they need to be resilient and build up their own resources, but at the same time hold the government accountable to build in infrastructure, yeah, blue gray hybrid, but taking into account the local context and using all these multiple disciplines. Engineering fixes should not come only from engineers. Yeah, it should come from multiple disciplines, including the biological sciences and the conservation community. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Joel, what about you?
Yeah, no, I agree. And when we see this in several stages of like awareness or action, right? The first is to really understand that the climate change impacts, like the floods that you see, is really due to climate change, as not, a random once in a blue moon event, right? And yes, the awareness is gradually building, but it's one that we really need to see universal awareness, right? How, in our schools, in our colleges, people need to understand this, right? There's not, a series of unlinked events, but it's really clear on the causes, right? So that's the first step, being aware. Then taking action, right? And Prof. Joy covered it extremely well about how you be that voice, to policymakers, so on and so forth. But also recognizing how your individual choices can have a large, impact on your personal footprint, right? And if this, many people shift their personal footprint, that has a tremendous impact, right? So everything from choosing, what is the type of car you buy, right? Do you think about, instead of just price alone, how do you think about the energy efficiency of the car, or for example, the light bulbs or appliances at your home, right? And I think these are really small steps, but very important steps if we take them together, which can shift the trajectory, right? So that awareness of also how you can shift your personal footprint is critical.
Thanks so much, Joel. And yeah, so once again, we seem to keep moving back to sort of a sense that it's actually about mitigation, but we've used the word mitigation actually with the word floods for a long time. May I push you perhaps to think about personal choices that could impact directly things like floods? What are some of the options that have been out there that actually need to be disseminated further and perhaps given more incentivization by the government so that we can develop those, particularly flash floods? It seems more like there's less and less focus on the seasonal floods and more and more focus now on flash floods, particularly when they impact urban communities. Is there anything at the community level that can be done to alleviate the impacts of flash? I understand maybe I'm not talking to engineers, but perhaps you might have something to share. Thanks. Joel, do you want to go, or you want?
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on this particular topic.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't press you either. Yes.
but I think, look, essentially, a lot of these solutions, right? It's one, thinking of it from the center and trying to have a one size fit all for the whole country, and that's not the way solutions to adaptation and resilience work. In fact, solutions will differ from locale to locale, and in fact, people within, there's tremendous knowledge on the ground, right? On for example, whether it's farmers, whether it's different planners in different areas or regions or cities, which have the knowledge of what could be potential solutions to adapt some of this, and it's really getting these views bottom up as well, right? Second, how do we, for example, use more advanced analytics? Coming back to some of the presentation earlier, because the effects will be different region to region. How do we prioritize our investments, so on and so forth, using some of the fact base? They become extremely important factors. And then the engineering solutions come in, right? And obviously there are experts to these, but I think local solutions, one. Second, making sure it's data driven, using analytics and the best tools that we have, right? I think those are important elements of the solution as well.
All right, Prof. Joy.
Thank you. I think Joe has given a nice explanation of how solutions have to be context and area specific. So any top solutions may work in some areas but may not work in others, because the people are different, the ground conditions are different, and the context may be different. So we all know now with climate change, the science, global science is already telling us with climate change, we expect flash floods. Yeah, we expect flooding, we expect climate hazards like landslides. But I think the question that we need to answer at the local level is, where is it going to happen? Yeah, not what's going to happen. It's about where floods are going to happen. So if you take an area based approach, then you can look at the area. Okay, in this area I expect flash floods, I expect coastal inundation, yeah, but I don't expect landslides because that would be in the hilly terrain.
Yeah.
So these are very, very important parameters to actually identify. And this requires multiple disciplines of sciences coming into play so that the engineering solutions are more targeted. Yeah. So you have your gray infrastructure that is more targeted, and you have your early warning system in these areas that is very targeted. Yeah, and your climate services can be more targeted for these areas. And these flash floods in urban area, which we call pluvial flooding, and is due to intense precipitation or rainfall, is actually now a new problem facing many cities. And if you look at our country, traditionally, our engineers are familiar with flooding from the rivers. Yeah,
Yeah.
river flooding. And there is very little data collected by cities on flash floods themselves. So for Kuala Lumpur, we have identified the areas on where this will be happening, and using different multiple sciences, types of sciences, so that we can take further action on this. And we are hoping to expand that to Selangor, so that you can have targeted engineering responses, targeted early warning systems. Yeah, because Selangor or Kuala Lumpur itself is very big. Where do you can't just invest money in expanding all your infrastructure and drainage. So let's take a targeted approach. Yeah, that would be the way to go. And we are now working with the City Hall of Kuala Lumpur, with JPS that's moving in this direction, so that we can see how we can handle this issue. And like I say, we are the frontliners. So anything we do that is successful will be picked up by other countries, yeah, in the tropics at least. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Joel, anything to add?
No,
Nope. All right.
they covered it
Okay.
earlier.
We'll go for some more questions from the audience. We have a question from Nadra Wan Yusuf, and she asks, nature-based infrastructure also needs to be considered in urban settings. And this, of course, is the assumption sometimes that nature-based solutions can only be implemented in rural settings. But she talks about urban settings like WSUDs, or water-sensitive urban design solutions. And she cites Singapore as an example, who have converted their urban drainage into a nature-based system. Could this be a part of a nature-based solution in Malaysia? Would it be a more integrated infrastructure approach to what we currently have in the Klang Valley, perhaps? I'm not sure who would like to take this. Perhaps we can start with you, Prof.
So I agree with you totally, Nadra, that we should be now pushing for all these integrated hybrid solutions, that is gray infrastructure and blue-green infrastructure as well, because they are very effective. And certainly I know Kuala Lumpur is making an effort to move in this direction, and it's baby steps yet, but at least the movement has started. And this is primarily due to, I think, the public push. So whatever you're doing, do more of it, the public out there. Yeah, do more of it in a targeted fashion, as Joe has pointed out, all the many different ways. Thank you.
Anything else to add to that, Joel?
Yeah, fully agree, and I
Yes.
think it's very important that there are also other enablers to this, right? It doesn't always start with infrastructure alone, but for example, when we think
Mhm.
about cities of the future, it's, for example, how do we reduce the amount of traffic and cars and so on and so forth, move to more efficient modes of public transport, which frees up roads, right? And then that can be converted to nature solutions and so on. So it always doesn't always start with the infrastructure to begin with, but changes in broader behavior enables then infrastructure to be repurposed, right? And thinking about that in terms of long-term development, of cities is critical, right? And then, but that's always the challenge of Kuala Lumpur is not a city that we are building greenfield. It's one that is
It's one
brownfield and
sort,
is
yeah.
and is there, right? And so, I mean, the changes will not come overnight, right? So, but I mean, just making sure that it's in part of the thinking and the planning that, for example, whenever we renew a piece of infrastructure and so on and so forth, where it's due, that thinking actively comes in, and that's part of the standards and so on and so forth. It is extremely critical.
Thank you so much. We have from K. Rosarina Kasim a very succinct question. What are the top 3 nature-based solutions that have the fastest and most impactful outcomes? And I suppose we might have to contextualize this. For like you said, it's location based. But in general, perhaps what are the top 3 nature-based solutions that will have the fastest and most impactful outcomes? Do you want to start, Joel?
Yeah,
Do
sure.
you think? Yeah.
So it's pretty hard to answer this from a solution perspective, because again it depends local, region to region, local to
Yeah.
local, right? But maybe take a perspective such as this, right? So we have nature-based solutions that we need to protect, and nature-based solutions that we need to build in, right? So for example, let's talk about mangroves in Malaysia, right? So one thing we can already start doing is not to worsen some of those which are already there, right? So for example, forests which are already there, which are earmarked, for example, for deforestation or degradation. So let's prevent that from happening, and the cost of prevention is typically much lower than the cost of building something, right? So that's where typically you get the highest impact from the action, preventing further loss of adaptation and resilience solutions, right? That's one. And then with where you invest to build that up, again depending on region by region, and prioritizing based on the solutions that specific location needs.
Thanks so much, Joel. What about you, Prof?
Thank you. I agree totally with what Joel said. First step is to protect. Yeah. Then you enhance and conserve. Yeah. Whatever you have, and then you restore. Yeah. Don't introduce exotic things. Yeah, just restore what was there. It doesn't mean bringing in exotic stuff into urban areas. Yeah, but I agree with Joel about the enablers, and one of the key enablers is actually a transformation in the governance systems itself for Malaysia at the local level, where we want more participation, equitable participation at the local level. And I think if you fix the governance problem in our country, yeah, in addition to all the other enablers coming into play, we will, if we strengthen, yeah, that governance system at the local level, we will have a lot of things moving, and capacity building, I think, should be focused at the local government level now. I think at the federal level, there's very high capacity. At the state level, is also quite high. But it's at the local level, they are lacking capacity. And one of the first things I suggested that the Klang Municipal Council can do is have a committee of experts drawing on the expertise of their surrounding universities, and also civil NGOs that are working in that area. And that is going to cost them zero. Yeah, zero is almost zero cost, but you're bringing in the expertise immediately to discuss the issues. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to play a bit of a devil's advocate. First of all, a little time check. We are at 5:19 now, and we have until 5:30 to run this. So about 10 minutes more, 11 minutes more. So if you in the audience want to get your question in, it'd be a good time to put it in. But playing devil's advocate a little bit here, just the idea that some have raised that nature-based solutions take too long. They're too soft. They themselves might be vulnerable to climate impacts. I mean, you could have an earth dike instead of a concrete dike, but an earth dike might fail more quickly. Trees might grow too slowly. If you have swathes for water flow instead of concrete drains, the swathes themselves might erode. In fact, we had a near disaster on a spillway of a dam recently in the US, because the spillway actually gave way and it began eroding the hillside, and the rate of loss of soil there was extremely high and actually endangered the dam itself. What would you say to those who would perhaps underrate some of the nature-based solutions that we've been practicing up to this point? Those who would perhaps argue for more technology and for more engineering and hard structures. What would you say to them? Thanks. Perhaps we could start with Joel.
Sure. I mean, there will always be cases such as this, right? And I think it's good not to extrapolate what we see in particular cases and translate that to a whole, right? And say that because of these few cases that we've seen, nature-based solutions by and large for adaptation resilience doesn't work, right? And I think that's one flaw we should avoid, and that awareness is important. But what I would say is that we do not have the luxury to choose, right? Given the position that we've put ourselves in, and the amount of the decarbonization we need, as well as the adaptation resilience that we need, we don't have the luxury to choose either to do technology-based solutions or nature-based solutions and take one path, right? I think we are at a point now that given the urgency of change, we do need to explore every avenue on both sides. And let the technologies compete against each other for its particular use cases, right? There will be certain areas that maybe the technological solutions are more mature, and by all means do adapt that. But in certain areas, the nature-based solutions might be superior, right? And it's making sure that we drive the innovation and development of solutions, allowing the solutions to compete against each other, right? And pilot testing and scaling the ones which work, right? And just to try these different avenues and not close anything off, I would say.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joel. What about you, Prof?
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that, beyond 1.5, there are many nature-based nature-based solutions that will become close to us. Yeah, so it's a closing window. So this is the time to actually deploy this. And there are some aspects that the evidence shows that if you draw on wide-ranging knowledge, you conserve and restore ecosystems, you involve marginalized groups, you prioritize equity and justice, you reconcile different interests, values, and worldviews. And in this context, whether it's somebody who is propagating a gray infrastructure or a mixture of blue-green infrastructure, all of these things, if you have this inclusive as work, if you do it in a very inclusive manner, I think we can make a big difference, particularly in the tropics where we are rich in nature. So for me, yes, the window is closing, but does that mean we give up? No, it means that we have to enhance all the work that we've done. We have to really ratchet it up and look at the way the world handled the COVID and the amount of finance that was poured into that, handling the pandemic. So surely, and the amount of finance required is far more little compared to what is required for developing the vaccine and deploying that. So that's something that should be borne in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Well answered, Prof. What about you, Joel? Anything to add?
No, nothing to add on that. Thanks.
Okay. We're once again quickly running out of time. We're at 5:24 now. 6 minutes left. In the remaining time, perhaps something you said sparked a thought, and it's about the effectiveness of some of these measures that mankind has come up with, okay, particularly in the face of COVID, and then also not forgetting the agreement and the convention on ozone depleting substances, which has been extremely successful at removing ozone depleting substances from refrigerants and other uses, and basically shutting down the ozone holes that formed at the northern and southern poles during the dark months. We have a question from Mr. Muthu Nainar, and it's a bit of a philosophical one, in the sense that as humans, the lower class is all as aspiring to be middle class. The middle class is aspiring to be a bit higher, and to enjoy some of the creature comforts that are enjoyed by the top, the B20 or the B10. Sorry, the T20 or the T10. So perhaps there is sometimes a sense that in our efforts to seek this kind of largesse, we will never make it. We might as well give up hope. I think perhaps a good way to end our conversation is to hear from you as experts, how you see humanity faring. Can we get outside ourselves? Can we think about generations, at the kind of lives that we've managed to live, which for the most part have actually been higher emissions lives. I mean, I grew up, many of us grew up in areas we if we didn't know where someplace was, we just drove around town for hours and burnt lots and lots of fuel. But we're so much more efficient now as a society, as a civilization. Can we put aside this desire for creature comforts and actually think about the plight of our children and our grandchildren? Perhaps this would be a good way to take us out. Can we start with you, Joel?
So I'm hopeful, right? And I say that for several reasons, right? I think, whenever we have had major challenges in the past, I think mankind as a whole has risen in some challenge. I mean, even with the recent one in COVID, I think particularly because that was urgent and large scale, that definitely, unprecedented action was mobilized against that, right? I think that the challenge with climate change is that, it's something extremely important, but the urgency isn't felt as much. And definitely we need to improve that. But even that, over the past, I would say 3 to 5 years, we've seen tremendous momentum, right? Like, just a couple of numbers, right? If we think about the number of countries which have committed to net zero, today it's about over 90% of global GDP. 2-3 years ago, it was less than 20 to 30%, right? So that's a huge jump. If we think about how financial institutions and investors are shifting on ESG, tremendous progress over the last few years, right? So I think there has been tremendous momentum over the last few years. It's really mainstream discussion now. So in that sense, I'm hopeful. Are we there yet? No, for sure not, right? But I see the momentum. I see focus on the topic, and the technologies are rapidly improving, right? So for example, with renewables and so on and so forth, they provide now cost competitive alternatives, and I think that's the key, the transition, right? The rise of really cost competitive, economically viable alternatives. That is really would be a key unlock.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joel. And Prof?
Yeah, I think what Joe said is really hopeful. Yeah, and I agree with him. There is much progress, and we among the scientific community, we have also in our collecting our evidence from the peer-reviewed literature, have observed all this jump in actions. Yeah, so that we are very, very hopeful. And but what I am a physical scientist who's talking about the need for equity and justice and reconciling interests and
Yeah.
values and worldviews, because the solution at the end of the day is in the social sphere. So it is the, we have identified the problems, but the solution is in the social sphere, it's in the private sector sphere. So actually it's the social push is really, really critical. And I cannot emphasize enough the emphasis on the need for equity and justice, particularly
Mhm.
from social scientists who need to speak more about this from the developed world. And we need to hear more of their voices as well in this debate, because as I say, the impacts are spatially differentiated. It's primarily in the tropics, it's in the Arctic, it starts that way, it's irreversible. Once you cross 1.5, even that overshoot is going to land humanity in a lot of problems. But the reality is, as the humans, the planet will survive. Planet has survived, and she will continue to survive. The question is, how will be the quality of life of humanity in there? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So I think I won't even try to summarize it. I think suffice to say that things are far more linked. Natural systems, policies, uh, innovations, all our strategies and action plans are far more linked to areas that we may not think that they are, particularly the social sphere, even to things like minimum wage and things like that. But I think that it's been a very enriching discussion. I'm sure that the audience has garnered a lot from what has been said this afternoon. What is left for me to do essentially is to thank everyone, particularly beginning with His Excellency Charles Hay for his deeply moving welcome remarks. Also like to convey our profound thanks to Prof. Joy and to Joel Kwong for their insights, amazing insights into the topic. We'd like to thank those in the background, New, Welton, Lavanya, and Zara, all supporting this evening's program. And of course, finally, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us on part one of this event. Now, do remember to join us for part two. Do tune in on Wednesday at the same time. Part two of nature-based solutions towards better adaptation and resilience from climate risks. And we will feature a week from now, 2 days from now, Wednesday, 2 days from now, three speakers who will be talking once again about a fairly diverse range of topics related to this particular issue. So until then, I wish everyone a very pleasant evening. Thank you for joining us once again, and see everyone on Wednesday. Everyone stay safe.
Thank you.